Hello everyone, welcome back to the Blue Team training series brought to you by Hackersploit and Linode. In this video, we're going to be exploring threat detection with Wazuh. So let's get started by getting an overview of what we'll be covering in this video. All right, so we're going to start off by getting an introduction to Wazuh, sort of understanding what it is and what it can do and how it works. We'll then move on to deploying Wazuh, and more specifically, we'll be exploring the process of deploying it on Linode, because Linode has a cloud template that you can use, or a cloud image rather, that you can use to easily set up Wazuh without having to go through the complicated installation process, because as you learn in a couple of seconds, Wazuh is built on top of the Elk stack, and I'll try and explain a little bit as to what that is. We'll then take a look at how to set up the Wazuh agents or a Wazuh agent on the operating systems that we would like to protect. And of course, we'll be ending the video by taking a look at how to use Wazuh for threat detection, response, and of course, vulnerability detection. All right, so if you've never heard of Wazuh, I don't blame you, but it really is one of the most powerful tools for a security engineer or for the blue team, and you'll see why in a couple of minutes. All right, so the prerequisites are the same as the previous video where we covered, how to set up and how to use Snort for intrusion detection. So let's get an introduction as to what Wazuh is. All right, so Wazuh is a free and open source platform that is used for threat detection, prevention, and response. It is typically used to protect networks, virtualized environments, containers, and cloud environments. So literally any computer or device can be protected with Wazuh. So in the context of blue team operations, Wazuh is a SIEM, or a security information event management system. You should be familiar with that if you are in the blue team. That is used to collect, analyze, aggregate, index, and analyze security-related data, consequently allowing you to detect intrusions, attacks, vulnerabilities, and/or malicious activity. All right, so in the context of blue team operations, a SIEM essentially displays, a ton of data, or it essentially aggregates or gets data from various sources, from log files, it's primarily log files, but it gets data from other devices and sensors, and it aggregates it and analyzes it, and then presents that data to the security engineer. And the way the data is presented is relative to to a particular security event or a vulnerability or an attack. So the objective of a SIEM is to essentially tell a security engineer, there's something going on this system. This is what happened. This is where the attack originated from. This system suffers from a vulnerability. This looks like malicious or suspicious activity, etc., etc. So in this video, we'll be focusing on how to use Wazuh to monitor security events and identify vulnerabilities on the actual systems that we're protecting. In this case, I'll just be calling them agents. Now, as I say this, it's very important to realize or to understand that Wazuh has a ton of features, which is absolutely fantastic, which is why I actually wanted to cover this particular tool. All right, so this is just a very small list of features that Wazuh essentially provides users with, or security engineers with. So firstly, you have security analytics, intrusion detection, log data analysis, file integrity monitoring, vulnerability detection, incident response, cloud security, container security, and you also have regulatory compliance. So there's a ton of stuff that it offers, and I'll be touching upon each of these features, but I'll be delving deeper into the actual setup process and how to get everything running, sort of giving you an overview of the interface, showing you how to essentially view your alerts using a few filters, so that you essentially become functional with Wazuh and understand what's going on the dashboard. So how does Wazuh work? All right, so Wazuh consists of the following components. You have your agent. All right, so if you've never utilized a client server model when it comes down to vulnerability management, An agent is essentially a cross-platform endpoint security agent or program that is installed on the system or host that you'd like to monitor. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I want to secure my home network, right? So that means every device or every computer on my home network, I would need to install an agent on it in order to essentially, in order for me to essentially communicate with the Wazuh server, which is the next component. All right, so the Wazuh server analyzes the data received from the Wazuh agents. It processes this data and it matches it against rule sets to identify indicators of compromise and generally speaking security events. So for example, once if I install the Wazuh agent on a Windows system and I configure it to connect to my Wazuh server, and I can just have that agent running on the system. If I make any changes, like I create a new user, or I try and I just do anything that requires any administrative privileges, that information will be logged as a security event on Wazuh, and you'll be able to essentially see what's going on. And as you can obviously tell, this is very important for larger or medium to large organizations, primarily because they have tons of computers that they own or the company owns, and they would like to know what's going on those computers. They would like to identify attacks or intrusions, and that is done through indicators of compromise. So again, this will make sense as we progress. We then have the Elastic Stack. All right, so the Elastic Stack displays and indexes the alerts generated by the Wazuh server and provides users with robust data visualization and analysis functionality. So if you're not familiar with the ELK stack, it's really very simple to understand. So the Elastic Stack, or also known as the ELK stack, is essentially the combination of three open source projects, one being Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. All right, so Elasticsearch is a search and analytics engine. Logstash is a server-side data processing pipeline that ingests data from multiple sources simultaneously, and of course, it then sends it to a stash like Elasticsearch. Kibana lets users visualize data with charts and graphs in Elasticsearch. So Wazuh is built on top of the ELK stack to facilitate, as I said, the actual analytics engine. So Elasticsearch handles the analytics, Logstash handles the actual data processing pipeline, and essentially gets data from multiple sources simultaneously. And Kibana lets you visualize this data in the form of a chart or graph. All right, so that's the Elastic Stack, also known as the ELK stack. Now, one really cool feature of Wazuh is that it can also be used to monitor devices like networking equipment that cannot run the Wazuh agent. So this works by essentially getting these devices like routers. They could be specific networking, network devices like firewalls. So the way you can get this to work is by having them log their data and then essentially transferring those logs or automating the process of having those logs synchronized to the actual Wazuh server for analysis. So you don't really need to install the agent, but it is extremely useful for additional functionality. So how does Wazuh work? So this diagram is from the Wazuh website, which we will actually be referring to throughout this video because their documentation really is fantastic. So as you can see right over here, you have your Wazuh agent. This is what you install on the devices that you'd like to protect. The Wazuh agent consists of various modules and the actual daemon, right? So the daemon is responsible for encryption, module management, remote configuration, and server authentication. And then the modules available are active response, command execution, configuration assessment, cloud security, container security, log collection, malware detection, system inventory. So all of these modules are used to get all of the relevant information back into the Wazuh server for analysis. And you might be asking yourself the question, why is all of this data important? Why do we need to, to essentially have a configuration assessment? Well, from the perspective of a security engineer, the configuration assessment module allows you to essentially run a configuration check to identify weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by attackers. In the case of log collection, that is pretty much self-explanatory. Logs are very useful in telling you what's going on that operating system. So if we go back to the example, if I install the Wazuh agent on a Windows system, and the log collection module is enabled and running, then that means that pretty much everything from the Windows event log is being logged and sent back to the Wazuh server for analysis. And the Windows event log pretty much tells me as a security engineer what's going on that operating system. Furthermore, and this is very important, Wazuh just doesn't display all of these logs for you. It goes through the actual processing engine, right? And all of these events or logs, if you will, are matched against rule sets, and if they are found to be malicious, or if they actually are malicious in a way, or are actually referring to, or indicating, or are indicators of compromise, then that is really all the information, that's the only information that's being displayed to you. So, we're primarily interested in security events, or events, related to security issues or exploits or malware. You get the idea, right? So, as you can see on the Wazuh server, this goes, the actual connection from the Wazuh agent comes into the agent connection service. That goes into the analysis engine for decoding and rule matching and correlation and enrichment. So, this can be used for threat intelligence, vulnerability detection, and of course, regulatory compliance. And then, of course, you have the actual agent registration service, which is only used when you're actually setting up a new agent. And you then have, of course, the raw data events, security alerts, and this goes into Elasticsearch. So this is the Elastic stack, whereby you have Kibana, and you have the Elasticsearch. You have Elasticsearch there. So Kibana provides us with the actual web user interface through the Wazuh plugin. You have the query language, and you can, of course, create visualizations and dashboards. Elasticsearch provides you the search engine, data analytics, long-term storage, security alerts, etc. So it's really very simple to understand. In our case, let me just head over to the next slide. This is the lab environment that I'm going to be using. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, I will be setting up or deploying a Wazuh server that Linode already has a cloud image for. That essentially will set up everything for you, because as I said, the process of setting up Wazuh can be quite time consuming and confusing, and ideally what I want these videos to be focused on is the actual usage of the tool, and actually showing you how it works, and how to navigate around the interface in the case of Wazuh. So this is going to be set up on the cloud. As I said, the Linode's cloud image is essentially an all-in-one deployment, whereby you have Wazuh running on the Elk stack, and everything is pretty much good to go. All you need to do is just open up Linode, go ahead and create a new Linode, and you specify the actual system resources, and you give it a couple of minutes to set up. Once that is done, you can access the actual Wazuh interface directly from your browser. So in my internal network, I'm going to have the very basic infrastructure here. I'm going to have a Windows 7 virtual machine, or just a Windows 7 system. It doesn't really matter, how it's deployed. And then, of course, we're going to have a Linux server that I'll also host on the cloud, but I've just put it in here for the purpose of simplicity. And I then have the attacker system where, I'm going to be trying different types of attacks. And in this case, it's not really going to be necessary, but I have already set up a Wazuh server for a very important reason that I'll get to in a second. Now, if you see the Wazuh icon next to any of these systems, then it means that we're going to be installing the agents on them, or the Wazuh agent on it, which means that all of these systems, the Wazuh agent is going to send all the information from these systems back to the Wazuh server, so that we get the actual we actually get an idea as to what's going on these operating systems from the perspective of a security engineer. All right, now let's talk a little bit about deploying Wazuh, because as per the official documentation, Wazuh can be deployed in two ways. So you have the all-in-one option, or a distributed infrastructure. So as for the all-in-one option, this is whereby the Wazuh server and the Elk stack are installed and configured on the same system or on the same server. That's what we're going for. And if you're a beginner, I would definitely recommend installing everything on one server. Now, one of the really cool things that Wazuh does is it provides users with a pre-built all-in-one OVA file or a virtual machine file that you can set up on your local network. So if you have VirtualBox and you want to try out Wazuh, you can download the OVA file, import it, and you'll have Wazuh on your network, and you can then use it and learn, how to use it on your local network. That is really, really very simple. You then have the distributed deployment option, where each component is set up on a separate server. This is typically suitable for larger environments for the purpose of scalability. So in this case, you would have the Wazuh server running on its own server. You then have the Elk stack running on another server. And the reason as to why you would want to do this is, as I said, for scalability purposes. And the fact that you can essentially, you can tweak or fine-tune performance based on your own requirements. So in our case, because we're only going to have, maybe one or two agents, we really don't need to use the distributed model. We're going to be using the all-in-one option, that is provided to us by Linode. So just going through what agents are. Wazuh agents are lightweight cross-platform agents that are used for endpoint security and connect to the Wazuh server, and consequently send all the logs and all the information back to the Wazuh server for analysis, and of course rule matching, and those are then displayed or presented to the security engineer on the actual Wazuh web interface. If you want to learn more about how to deploy Wazuh, how to install it, you can take a look at the official Wazuh documentation repository. It really is fantastic. All right, so now that we have an understanding as to what Wazuh is, its features, how we can deploy it, we can actually get started with the practical demonstration. So I'm going to be performing or accessing Wazuh. So we're going to set up the Wazuh server on Linode through my Kali Linux VM. As I said, you can do this from whatever operating system you want. One of the cool things is that we don't even need to SSH into the Wazuh server, because once we set the Linode up, then we pretty much have to give it a couple of minutes. Once it's set up, we can then get started. So let me just switch over to my Kali Linux VM. All right, so I'm back on my Kali Linux VM, and as you can see, I have set up an Ubuntu server that we're going to be installing the Wazuh agent on, but that's for later. And then we have the Wazuh production server, which I set up and configured already. I haven't changed the default settings. I've just set up the Windows agent. So I'm going to be using that particular Linode here. But to get started, let me show you how to create your own Wazuh server, if you will. So I'm just going to click on create here and make sure you're logged into your dashboard. Just head over and create a new Linode and click on marketplace, and you can immediately launch the Wazuh app directly here. So there we are, we have Wazuh here. So you can click on that. If you have I do recommend entering an address for the Let's Encrypt SSL certificate. So if you are setting this up for production, then of course you're also going to be setting up a domain for the Wazuh server. But in our case, we really don't need to do that. So you can enter an email here, so test@test.com, because I'm not going to be using this server. You can then create a limited sudo user. And I do recommend doing this. So in my case, I can just say Alexis, specified the password for the limited sudo user. If you want to use an SSH public key for authentication or an SSH key pair, then you can say disable root access over SSH, or you can select the SSH public key directly from here. Disregard this if you're not using the actual, Linode's DNS service. And of course, if you are, then you can specify the subdomain for the DNS record and the actual domain here. Wazuh is set up on Ubuntu 20.04, which is fine. And then you can select the region closest to you for the purposes of speed and latency. I can select London, for example. Now, this is very, very important. This is where the resources come into play. So let me just head over to the Wazuh website, because I do want to explain a couple of things. So this is the Wazuh website. It's accessible on wazuh.com. And as you can see from the description, Wazuh is a free, open source, and enterprise-ready security monitoring solution for threat detection, integrity monitoring, incident response, and compliance. So I do recommend taking a look at the documentation here, and more specifically under the actual installation guide, you can click on requirements, and you can see, this is these are the supported Linux distributions. So you have an AMI image for Amazon, AWS. You have CentOS, Debian, Fedora, OpenSUSE, Oracle, Red Hat, and Ubuntu. Any version of Ubuntu newer than 14.04. All right. One thing, as I said, that you want to keep in mind is the resource consumption. So in a distributed deployment, both the Wazuh server and Elastic Stack are installed on separate hosts. This configuration is recommended for environments that require high availability and scalability of the services. The Wazuh server and Elastic Stack can both be installed as a single node or as a multi-node cluster. Kibana can either be installed on the same node, Elasticsearch on a dedicated host. So the hardware recommendations are provided here. So if you are setting this up for production based on 100 users, they do recommend 8 gigs of RAM and 4 CPU cores. However, as I said, in our case and in your case, if you're only testing a couple of agents, then you can use 2 gigs of RAM with 1 CPU or 2 gigs of RAM with 2 CPUs as specified here. So you also need to keep in mind that because we're not using a distributed deployment, we're using the standard all-in-one deployment here. You can see that there we are. The minimum requirements for this type of deployment are 4 gigs of RAM and 2 CPU cores, and of course a 64-bit operating system is required. So a typical use case for this kind of environment supports around 100 agents. So based on that number, you can essentially identify or determine what you require in terms of what is required in terms of system resource consumption. So, in this case, because I'm not going to be setting this up, you can use any of these. So this is the recommended one, the Linode 4 gigabyte, the actual 4 gigabyte option here. And that also has 80 gigs of storage and a 4 terabyte transfer limit per month. And you also get the network connection here. So you can then provide it with a name. So I can say Wazuh test, and then specify the password for the root user. And that's pretty much it. I mean, if you want to get started, this is pretty much it, as opposed to actually manually installing Wazuh. So again, if you take a look at the installation instructions, if I go into the actual all-in-one deployment and the installation methods, we have an unattended installation, or the step-by-step installation. You can see that this is quite lengthy. So thanks to Linode, we don't need to go through any of that. We just need to set up the parameters here, and you can then click on create. As I said, we're not going to be using this one because I've already set up a Wazuh server. So there we are, and there we are. So it's actually provisioning, so that'll take a couple of seconds. As I said, I'm not using this, so I'll just delete that, and we'll take a look at the Wazuh production one that I set up here. So in order to access Wazuh, you just need to copy the IP, unless you have actually configured DNS and you have a domain name. You can then access it via that domain name or the subdomain that you've set. If you've not set a domain and you're using this for testing, just copy the IP, open up a new tab. Make sure you open up the IP in your browser with HTTPS as opposed to HTTP. The first time you do that, you'll be asked to essentially accept or confirm that the SSL certificate is not valid. As I said, in production, you want to make sure that you have a valid SSL certificate. But after a couple of minutes, because Wazuh will actually take a couple of minutes to set up, because if you try and access it immediately after you set up the Linode, you're going to see an error here. So give it probably around 5 minutes to set up. So you can go get yourself a cup of coffee, and when you're back, you can then open up the IP. And of course, you now have the actual Elastic Stack here. So this is perfectly normal. Wazuh is set up on top of the Elastic Stack, as I said. So the default credentials are admin and admin, which I did not change, just to show you that this is the case. So in your case, just type in admin, admin, and we'll give this a couple of seconds to load up. After which, you will be taken directly to the Kibana dashboard here. and it should actually open up Wazuh. There we are. Fantastic. So it's going to run a couple of checks. It's going to check the API, and it's going to run a couple of other checks. Once those checks are passed, it's then going to take a couple of seconds to load up, and you should have access to Wazuh right over here. So this is the screen you'll be greeted with. In my case, you can see I've already added the Windows 7 agent. So again, just disregard that. You should have 0 agents and 0 active agents. Right, so welcome to Wazuh. So let's get started with the first step, and that of course is to change your default password. So by default, you're the admin user, so you can go ahead and reset your password because that is recommended. You never want an attacker to essentially gain access to Wazuh because then they pretty much can do whatever they want, or understand or get an idea as to what agents you have or what systems are part of the organization. So the current password is admin, and I can set up a new password here. Let me just type that in correctly. So there we go. And I can then hit reset. So that's very important. Resource admin is read only. Let's see. Why is that failed to reset password? Forbidden message resource admin is read only. Oh yes, I think I know what's causing that issue. That's because you actually need to log into the Wazuh server that you've just set up, and you need to modify the filebeat configuration file, which is in YAML. That will allow you to change your credentials. So we can just hit cancel here. So in order to do that, log into your Wazuh server that you set up on Linode via SSH. You can also do it via their really cool, I'll just open it up here. They also have a really cool Lish console, which will just open it up for you here. So in a new window, you can access SSH within your browser. So that'll probably prompt me to log in. Indeed, it's already logged me in. So let me just click on that here. And for some reason that is not expanding. I do not want to do that. Let me just open it up again. And there we are. So in order to essentially change the admin password, just open up the file etc filebeat and filebeat.yaml. So YML, hit enter, and as you can see, you can change your username and password here. All right, and you can also customize a few other options, but again, in this case, this is really not required. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this, or you can, you know what, I'm just going to leave it as default, because in my case, I'm not really using this for production, but in your case, that's how to change it. Once that is done, just try logging out and logging back in. All right, so we'll have a notification here. This is pertinent to Elastic. So if you right click on this little sidebar here, you can see that you have the Wazuh plugin or Wazuh running on top of Elastic, which makes sense. And then of course you have Kibana here. And at the bottom, you have the open distro for Elasticsearch, where you can take a look at the query workbench, reporting notebooks, alerting, anomaly detection, trace analytics, index management, security, etc. And then, of course, you have stack management, which if I click on it here, you can take a look at the index patterns. In this case, the index patterns are already configured for Wazuh, where you have Wazuh alerts. You also have Wazuh monitoring and Wazuh statistics. You can create your own your own index pattern if you want, based on the actual index available. So you can see that I can create or define the actual index name, and I can specify, for example, Wazuh alerts 4.0 or 4.x. So let's go back into Wazuh. So I'll just click on it here. And there's a few things that I need to explain firstly, right? So again, just give it a couple of seconds. Once that is loaded, what we want to do is let's click on this drop down here. So by default, it'll take you to the modules page. So these are all the available modules or features, if you will. So you have under security information management, you have security events, which is very important. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So this allows you to browse through your security alerts, identify issues and threats in your environment. You then have integrity monitoring. This essentially shows you alerts related to file changes, including permissions, content ownership, and attributes. Very, very important. You then have threat detection and response, which is what we're also going to be taking a look at. So We have vulnerability detection, so discover what applications in your environment are affected by well-known vulnerabilities. And then you have the Mitre attack framework here, or the Mitre attack tactics, techniques, and procedures. So this will display security events from the knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques used on real-world observations. So what that means is, in the case of the Mitre attack module, is that it, for example, if someone compromises a system within my network and they use a particular technique, like they try and change or add a new user, then this module will essentially identify that particular event and will essentially link it to a Mitre tactic, technique, or procedure, and will give you that ID. So you can essentially start, performing threat modeling and, get a better threat intelligence in regards to what you're dealing with, which is also very, very useful. You then have auditing and policy monitoring, where you have policy monitoring, where you can verify that your systems are configured according to your security policies baseline. This is very important. So if you work in an organization, then you know that a company has, or an organization usually has, a security policy that applies to pretty much, employees, systems, email security, password security, etc. And based on the actual company or organization's security policy for systems, you can essentially get a hold of that, and you can then see how it's doing, against that security policy, or actually verify that all the systems that you've added or that you're monitoring are in line or in accordance with that security policy. You can also perform a security configuration assessment. This is very interesting, or very useful, because it allows you to scan your assets as part of a configuration assessment audit. You can also perform system auditing, again, extremely useful. So this audit uses behavior, monitoring, command execution, and alerting on access to critical files. The area that we'll not be taking a look at, because again, we're really not interested in that at this point, is regulatory compliance, where you can essentially test systems, based on the following regulations or compliance standards. So we have PCI DSS, which is used for, this is usually very helpful for organizations that, that essentially store or transmit payment or cardholder data. And of course, you have HIPAA, which is, for companies that are essentially in the health industry, GDPR, NIST 853. So really, really powerful. Okay, so those are the modules. If you click on this drop down here, you can see that it'll provide you with the modules directory, which we've already accessed here. You then have management. This is very important. This is where you have the administration section and the status and reports. So this is where you have your rules, decoders, CDP lists, groups, and configuration. So under rules, this is where it'll essentially tell you can manage your rules. So by default, you'll get 3,148 rules. You can manage the rule files. So, there we are. You can actually view each of these rule files. They're in XML. So this is just a generic template here. But if we take a look at a couple of interesting ones, like Cisco iOS rules, for example, you can see that, there are rules set up for specific types of intrusions or, security events. So this is, again, very, very similar to what Snort does in regards to intrusion detection. The only thing is that Wazuh, visualizes or displays this in a much better way, right? And so that's rules. You can also import files and export the formatted files, and you can also take a look at custom rules, right? So this is the local rules.xml file. As I said, very, very similar to how Snort works. So let's go back to management. We've taken a look at rules. We then have decoders, which I'll not be exploring, but this is essentially responsible for decoding, the information that's being sent into Wazuh for processing and analysis. You then have groups, where you can essentially create agent groups. So based on your organization, I can create a group and say, for example, Linux servers. I'll just call it servers here. So these are organizational units, where you can essentially, assign agents to them based on their role or functionality within an organization. So you can see this is the default one here. This is where I've already added the Windows 7 system. So I've already configured the agent on it. So if I go into files, you can see this is essentially, the list of, you can list and see your group files, and you can also edit the group configuration. So again, that's something that's really not important at this point. So if we go back to management, we then have the configuration. So this is very important. So this is essentially where you can customize Wazuh and get it to work the way you want it to work. So this configuration file is literally the home of everything. Like with any tool that runs on Linux, the conf file is very important. So you have your main configurations, whereby you have the global configuration, the cluster registration service. So this is for the automatic agent registration. You then have alerts and integrations. So if you want to see the current alert configuration, it's going to open up the OSS. Let me give that a couple of seconds. This is still for alerts. So you can essentially specify the general alert settings, whereby you can set the minimum severity level to store the alert, the minimum severity level to send the alert by email. So you can modify that based on your requirements. Now you might be saying to yourself, I can't really modify this. However, if you click on JSON here, then you can modify it in JSON format, and you can also do it in XML format. I'll get into this in a second. And then, of course, you can configure email alerts, which I'll also get to, where you can configure the SMTP server and the email that you'd like to use, in order for Wazuh to send you email notifications or email alerts, which is very important for any security engineer. You then have reports, right? And in this case, the configuration is not available because, you need to customize that yourself. So the configuration is sorted into all of these segments. So for example, under system threats and incident response, you can see that in my case, I've enabled vulnerability detection, and by default, it's not going to be enabled in your case. And then you can specify the interval between the scan executions. If you click on it, you can see that you cannot actually modify it. So you have to do it either through JSON or XML. And if we actually go back to that, I didn't cover one important aspect there, and that, of course, is providers, where you can see in this case we're using the NVD database. So that's just a very basic vulnerability. That's a very basic signature database that's typically used by vulnerability scanning tools like OpenVAS or Nessus. So in order to configure these options, I typically like modifying the entire configuration. So this will open it up here in XML format. So firstly, you have your OSS EC or OSSEC configuration, where you can firstly configure, the JSON output format. You can set that to yes. This will make sense in a couple of seconds. I recommend leaving that as yes. We want to log alerts. Do we want to log all? No. Log all JSON? No. Email notification, we can set that to yes. You can then configure your SMTP server, who is the email from, and the email to, and then of course email the actual amount of emails to send per hour. And there we are, the agent's disconnection time, so 10 minutes. And of course you then have the agent's disconnection alert time, which is 0. Right, under alerts, you can see that's the option that we were able to configure a couple of seconds ago, or a couple of minutes ago, in the actual configuration, in the actual configuration page. And then, of course, right over here, you have logging, right? So you can choose between plain JSON or plain JSON for the format of internal logs. This is very important. So currently it's set to plain. I recommend leaving that as is. And then, of course, you have policy monitoring. So this is it disabled? No. So that means it's enabled. So it'll check files, check Trojans, yes. Check dev, check sys, check process IDs, yes. And check ports, yes. So leave all of this, turn all of this to yes, and make sure that this is set to no. That is essentially the disabled flag. So if you set this to yes, then it'll disable policy monitoring. All right, you then have the next important one is going to be the OS query integration. So you have the ability to enable OS query, because OS query is quite important. So let me just open up a new tab, and I'll open up OS query here in a couple of seconds. Right, so OS query, I'll just wait for this to load up, and this will really explain it. So performant endpoint visibility. So OS query essentially uses basic SQL commands to leverage a relational data model to describe a device. So it essentially allows you to, learn more about your device. And in the case of Wazuh, it allows Wazuh to make queries, to learn more about the actual system where the agent is installed. So if I go back in here, the next option I'm going to set that we need to set is the system inventory. So this is currently enabled, and the actual name is syscollector. So this will essentially get all information regarding the system. So you can see that it'll get the hardware information, the operating system information, network, packages, ports, processes, etc. Ports is currently set to no. So ports all no and yes. Okay, so that's fine. You then have the database synchronization settings. I would recommend leaving that as is. All right, you then have the vulnerability detector. So by default, it's going to be set to no. So make sure you set this to yes for enabled. So now the flag is enabled. So make sure enabled is set to yes. The interval is 5 minutes. That's perfectly fine. Run on startup, yes. And then you can specify whether you want to check for Ubuntu OS vulnerabilities, Debian, Red Hat, and in the case of Windows, I've enabled it. So because I am going to be installing an agent on Ubuntu, I'm going to say enable yes for Ubuntu, and we'll also enable this for Debian. So I'm just going to say enabled yes. And this is for Ubuntu. It's going to support all versions of Ubuntu from 16.04 all the way to the latest version. So yeah, that's important. The next is to aggregate vulnerabilities. Make sure that's set to yes, and you can then specify the actual age of the vulnerability database that you're using. In this case, the provider name is NVD. So you can also get other providers. So, if I search for example, if I just open up a Google search and I say Wazuh vulnerability providers and give this a couple of seconds, you should be able to import your own. So let me just see if I can find one that works here. So yeah, within the docs, that's why I say always refer back to the docs. So this essentially explains how vulnerability detection works. So in the case of Ubuntu, it uses canonical.com to pull CVEs from for Ubuntu Linux distribution. So you can also add that as well. So if we go back into the actual Wazuh configuration here, you can essentially enable that if you want. And then, of course, that's the end of the vulnerability detector section. You then have file integrity monitoring. You can set that. You can enable it. It's enabled by default, so this should be set to no. And then, of course, scan on start, that is yes. And the other option that we would need to configure would be the actual active response, which is by default enabled, which is perfectly okay. And yeah, that's really what you need to do to get started. All right, so once that is done, you can just hit save. And then I would recommend restarting the manager. So this will take Wazuh offline for a couple of seconds. And there we are. So changes will not take effect until a restart is performed. So you can see it's going to fail all of these checks, and this is because it's restarting. So I'm just going to reload my page again, and it should run the checks, the health check again. And that should tell us that everything is okay. If it isn't, then again, just give it a couple of seconds. So I'll just refresh that again. In this case, the API is still down. So again, just give it a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes. If you want to view the error, you can do so. You can see the current API, the Wazuh API is down. I can retry that again to see if it's back up. There we are. So everything's back up now. And yeah, so that was the management section. As I said, you can also take a look at status, the status. So if we click on status, it tells us that we have no permissions. That's really weird. If we go back to management and we click on the actual statistics, that should display statistics for us. So this is the listener engine. Yeah, so this tells you the network traffic. So total number of bytes received, events sent to analysis D, or the analysis daemon, message statistics. In your case, this is all going to be empty until you add an agent. All right, so that is the actual management tab, you then have agents, which you should be familiar with at this point. That just displays your active agents. In this case, for some reason, it's not displaying it. So I'm just going to log out again and log back in because I think there's an issue with my cookies. All right, so I just logged out and logged back in, and you can see that in my case, because I've already added an agent, it's displaying it here. So once you add an agent, this is the page that will be displayed, and you'll have all the other agents essentially displayed here. So it'll display the ID, the name, the IP address, the group, the OS, the cluster node, the version, the registration date, and of course, you then have the status, which tells you whether it's alive or whether it's inactive, meaning it's either been shut down or there's something wrong with the agent configuration. All right, so that's agents. And then, of course, you have tools where you can essentially access the API console and a rule set test. Under security, you have the ability to create other users. You then have roles, policies, and roles mapping based on your organization. And then, of course, under settings, you have the logs, miscellaneous, modules. So if you click on modules, this will show you all the modules installed for Wazuh. So in this case, you can see that security events is installed, integrity monitoring is installed, Amazon AWS is disabled. That's perfectly fine. So this is for the auditing and policy monitoring. You can see configuration assessment and automation for the compliance monitoring using SCAP checks. That's disabled. You can also enable the virus total module, which will essentially generate alerts resulting from virus total analysis of suspicious files via an integration with the API, which is fantastic. And you can then enable OS query to essentially expose an operating system as a high performance relational database. This is really not that important. But you also have the ability to set up the Docker listener to monitor and collect the activity from Docker containers such as creation, running, starting, stopping, or pausing events. And of course, you have your regulatory compliance modules there. You then can essentially import some sample data if you want to learn more about how to use it. But again, that's really not necessary. The current settings, I would recommend leaving them as they are because they're really configured very well at to begin with. If we take a look at logs, these are all the logs here generated by Wazuh. So looks like we had a few errors, but everything's running now. And then of course you have the miscellaneous options where you can run the health check and about. All right, so those are the settings. Now let's get into agents and let's talk about deploying a new agent. So I can deploy a new agent. And you can do that directly from your actual dashboard. So if I click on Wazuh here, or just open that up and click on Wazuh, I can click on total agents, and then in your case, just click on deploy a new agent. Now, based on the operating system, so it could be Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, Windows, or macOS. You can select the actual operating system that's running on the host that you'd like to monitor. So in the case of Windows, because this is very important, it'll give you a PowerShell command that you need to run that will essentially download the Wazuh Windows agent, and then it'll configure it with your the IP address option. So make sure that you specify your Wazuh IP address. So make sure you copy this value here and replace it here. So just make sure you replace the IP there, and then you can add it to a group. You can say default. In our case, we created the Linux servers group, which is okay. And in this case, we can select Debian Ubuntu, and this is going to be x86, x64, and this command will essentially get it set up for us, right? And then you can start the agent using the actual init system that's installed on your version of Ubuntu. So in this case, we can use systemd. So we can say sudo system control daemon reload, enable Wazuh agent, and start the Wazuh agent. So I just wanted to explain one thing in regards to the actual, in regards to installing the Windows agent. So I would typically not recommend using the PowerShell command here. Instead, I would recommend if you go back to Wazuh and you click on, so if you're on the web page here, you can click on install Wazuh. And then for the agent, just click on Windows, right? That's going to open up another window here. and you want the GUI option. So this is the Wazuh Agent Manager. You can download the actual executable from here. So there's the Windows installer. Once it's downloaded, I'll just switch over to my Windows VM and show you how that works. So I'm back on the Windows VM or Windows system. Under my downloads, you can see I have the Wazuh agent for Windows. So that's a setup file. Just double click on it and go through the installation wizard. Once it's done, you will be provided with the Wazuh Agent Manager. So this is, you can see mine is currently registered. So in your case, just enter your Wazuh server IP. You don't need to enter the authentication key and then just hit save and then click on manage, and you can then click on start, stop, restart, or the status. So you can see mine is currently running. I can stop it or start it, etc. Right? And if you click on view, you have the ability to view the logs produced by the Windows agent itself. And you then have the actual configuration for the agent itself. So this is also very important. It's very similar to the configuration, the Wazuh configuration file. So let me just see if I can zoom in here so you can actually see what's going on. Just click on font. And I'll just make that 16 there so you can see what's going on. So again, these are just options pertinent to the agent itself. And in the case of Windows, you firstly have the actual notify time and the time reconnect, which is set to 60 seconds. So that's set by default. The one option that I would recommend that you change that could be disabled based on your own system is going to be under, let's see, do we have it under the system inventory? No, that's not the option there. Yes, that is OS query, right? So you can essentially enable OS query here. So you can set that to no if you want to enable it. That's if you enable OS query on the Wazuh server, otherwise it's not going to work. So yeah, that's pretty much all that I would change there. And then you can just hit manage and reload. So once you do that, you should get a connection back from the agent on the Wazuh server. So let me just switch back to my Kali Linux VM. All right, so that is how to set up the Windows agent. Now we're taking a look at how to set up the Linux agent. So I'll say x86, x64. I'm adding it to Linux servers. I just need to copy this and then follow the instructions here to start the agent. So this will ensure that it runs on system startup. So what I'll do here is let me just go back into my Linodes and I'll click on Ubuntu server and I'll just log into the server. So this is the Wazuh server. So I'll say SSH root and I'll paste that in there. So there's the IP. Just going to hit yes and provide my password. And there we are. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I just want to make sure I update my repositories. So sudo apt-get update and sudo apt-get upgrade. That's going to upgrade any packages that need to be upgraded. So there we are. That's going to upgrade everything so that we are working from a clean slate. And we'll give this a couple of seconds. All right, so the packages are upgraded. I'm just going to go back into Wazuh now, and I'm just going to copy the command that'll essentially download and install the Linux or Debian agent. Make sure that the IP has been set correctly and the group has been set correctly. So I'll just switch back over into my terminal, paste that in there, hit enter. That's going to set up the Wazuh agent. There we are, that's done. And then of course we can just reload the daemon. If you are running on an Ubuntu or Debian system that uses init or sysv as the init system, then you can specify the sysv init options there. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to say sudo system control daemon reload. So sudo system ctl daemon reload. Okay. And then we're going to say sudo system ctl enable Wazuh agent.service. That's going to enable it on startup, and then we need to start it. It should be started, but we'll just start it. So instead of enable, we'll now say start. And we'll give this a couple of seconds, and it should be registered as an agent. So if there are no errors here, then everything should have worked out just fine. So there we are. And then we can check the status to see if it's running. There we are. So it's loaded and active. Fantastic. So let's go back into this page here. So that's done. So we should get another agent. So I'm just going to reload this now. And after a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes, we should get the call back from the agent or from that system that has the agent running. In this case, it's the Linux system. There we are. Fantastic. So we can see that we get all the information related to this particular system. We get the actual host name, the IP, the actual group we added it to, the operating system, and of course its actual status. Okay, so we can then click on an agent, which is what I wanted to showcase now. Now, when you click on an agent, and this is very important, this is information displayed pertinent to a particular agent, right? So you're going to have this little toolbar at the top that will allow you to cycle through, various dashboards that give you information related to security events, integrity monitoring, SCA, system auditing, vulnerabilities, Mitre attack, and if you click on more here, then you can essentially access the regulatory compliance options as well. You can see right now it looks like it's performed a scan already, but let's get started firstly with the security events because that's the dashboard. So you can see that right now, do we have any security events? It looks like there are a couple of security events. Very interesting. So in this case, the actual agent ID filter is set to 002, which is very important. So the filter option is important because it allows you to select a particular agent. So if I click on filter and say agent.id, in which you can also use the IP if you want. So I can say if add the agent ID is 101 or 001, which is the Windows system, 002 is the Linux system, 000 is the actual Wazuh manager server that we set up on Linode. So we don't want that, but yeah, you have the ability to set up your own filters. In this case, the filter is set correctly. So the dashboard will display the alert group's evolution. So in this case, you can see we have some SSH alerts, invalid logins, authentication failed, syslog, and SCA. So these are color coded. You can also, specify the actual time in regards to what you want displayed, when you're talking about security events. So right now it's showing the last 24 hours, which is perfectly fine. And at the top here, you'll have the total amount of events. Level 12 or above alerts are set to 0. Authentication failures have been set to 12, which is interesting. And authentication success, which I guess was us. And then at the bottom, you have the top 5 alerts and top 5 rule groups. And of course, you then have the top 5 PCI DSS requirements. And at the bottom here, you have your security alerts, right? Now, the awesome thing about this is you're going to see that they're going to have the actual time column, the Mitre tactics or techniques in this case, and then the tactic and the description, the level, and the rule ID. Okay, so in this case, we can see that it looks like there was an attempt to log in as a non-existent user. If we click on the Mitre technique here, it'll actually display that and tell you what it pertains to. So in this case, you can see credential access. So adversaries may use brute force techniques to attempt to access accounts when passwords are known. So okay, so you can start to see how this is useful now because it's essentially telling you what's going on. However, if you click on this little drop down, this will give you more information regarding this particular security alert. So in this case, we're not really interested in the, in these top options here. We're interested in the actual Mitre ID, which is provided us here. And then, it tells us the log here. Interesting. So it looks like we have our first security event. And, to be fair, to be honest, guys, this is real. This is actually real. I'm not kidding about, I haven't performed this attack. It looks like this user performed it, and we can take a look at the time here. They performed it. If we take a look at that here, it should actually tell us the time at the top. But either way, it tells us, that this was performed on the following date at 5:59. All right, and the user was Katarzyna, or whatever that is. But that is very interesting. So it looks like this server has been, or really has actually gone through a brute force attack, which is absolutely insane. Indeed, it has. So you can see Cynthia here. So it's coming from localhost. Yeah, that's correct, and disconnected. So if we click on page 5, These are all CVEs. Let's click on the last page here. If we click on this one here, we can see that these are just security alerts. Yeah, these are not relevant, but we can essentially, if we click on the level, we can essentially display them from the highest. So these are already CVEs because the vulnerability detection option was enabled, but it looks like they are CVEs that affect this Linux server. Very interesting. So we can see that the CVE here is CVE 2021. Yeah, this is this is a quite a modern CVE here, or vulnerability. If you click on the rule description, that should display it here. So this is, we can actually perform research on this. If we click on the rule ID, that'll tell you more about this particular rule, right? So in this case, this is part of the vulnerability detector, and it'll give you more information regarding this particular vulnerability. So it is critical. Interesting. So, if we go back a step, which is what we wanted to do, or we could just go back into agents and then click on the Linux agents once again. So I'll click on it here, and this is the main dashboard, right? So it looks like our system is actually being attacked, which is so insane to think that this is happening live without me even scripting this, which is actually kind of cool. So yeah, the point I was trying to make is you can actually see that's increased. So this server is actively being attacked, which I'll get to in a second, right? So, and there's only been one successful authentication here. So if we click on that here, you can see that this was this us? I believe it could have been us. I'm not really sure. Because the actual date configuration on the server is different than my time here. So yeah, but that's very interesting. So, I'll just get rid of this filter here, and we can take a look at the security alerts displayed here. So this looks like it's the latest one. So let's take a look at what user they try to log in as this time. So Eli. It actually looks like the servers are getting attacked quite a lot, which is very, very interesting. I wonder if that's the case for this particular, for the actual Wazuh manager, which is very interesting. So, if I go back into the actual dashboard here, or rather if I go into modules and I click on security events, and I can get rid of that filter because I don't want to, can I get rid of that filter? Not really sure, because if I click on events here, this will display all of the events. I'll get to that in a second, but yeah, let me just go back into my agents for a second, because there's something I wanted to highlight that I didn't. So I'll go into, we have taken a look at security events, right? So the dashboard displayed here, as I said, we've already gone through that. But you can see that based on the color coding, if you can customize that if you want. But yeah, there is a brute force, an active brute force going on here, and it's getting that log from the actual auth log on the Linux system. So under var log auth.log, which is kind of scary. So Ibrahim looks like he's trying to gain access. Pretty crazy stuff, right? So as I was saying, you can also click on the events tab, which will essentially just display the events without any visualization. So give this a couple of seconds, and you can see that you can also sort these based you can sort them and essentially sort them based on ascending or descending values if there is a value. But you can see we have all of the actual security events being displayed here. And yeah, so it looks like this is a brute force attack. So because of the Mitre module, we pretty much know what the attacker is doing. So this is where threat intelligence comes into place, and this is where you learn about attacks, which is actually fantastic. I really didn't script this because we're going through a real-time attack now. So I'm going to show you how we can defend against this attack. So let's so that's events, which I've already talked about. You can also add other available fields here. So for example, I can add all available fields that might be useful in this case. So, I don't really see one here, but we can also add the geolocation. So I can add that there, and this is going to add it to the columns. And in this case, there we are. Looks like we actually see that, yeah, they're performing a brute force from different countries. Very interesting, very interesting. We're learning more about our attacker. In this case, it looks like they failed to log in as, let's see, what user did they use here? So that's the actual rule ID. Failed to use FTP1 user. Okay. Very interesting. Okay, so yeah, that's essentially the actual events page. I'm just going to go back into localhost here. And that's the Linux system, which you can rename on the Linux system itself. You then have integrity monitoring. So this essentially allows you to, again, as it says, perform integrity monitoring. I can't even spell that correctly, but if you click on inventory, this will give you an inventory, as it says here, of all the files on the system. So you can essentially search for one, and then under events, this will tell you whether a file has been changed, etc. So I'll give you an example of this here. So I'm currently on the Linux server that's currently under attack. If I open up htop here, we can see that resource consumption is fairly minimal. But if I say netstat antp, let me just install that. So sudo apt-get install net tools. And just give this a couple of seconds. And I say netstat antp, we can see, yep, the FTP. There is another. Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah, it looks like someone else is logged onto the system. Oh my goodness. Well, that's unknown. I say who. Yeah, there's only one user logged on, which is me. But there is another connection established. That is very interesting. And that is on port 22. The IP address is different here. Established, that's the Wazuh agent. That's very interesting. Really, really interesting. So what we can do to stop this brute force is by going back into our configuration here under management and configuration, and we want to modify the configuration, and we're going to add an active response rule because as I said, Wazuh actually has incident response or intrusion prevention, if you will. So yeah, under here, I'm just going to add a new line. So I'm just going to say active response, and that's the syntax there. Fantastic. So we can then say command, and we'll also require, so what we want to do is we can say firewall drop. Let's see, firewall drop. And because this is on Linux, so that's the command there. So firewall drop, we can then say location, location. Let me see if I can type that in correctly. Location. And we'll leave this as is for now because we still need to fill that information in. We then need the rules ID. So when a rule is triggered, then this comes into play. And then we need a timeout. So the timeout we can set, to maybe timeout. Let's see, timeout. I actually believe I know where that other session came from. That was probably from the Lish terminal, which I should have actually known. The timeout we can set to maybe 1,000 seconds or 10,000 seconds. But yeah, that's how to add an active response, or how to add, an incident response rule based on a particular intrusion. So before we do that, if I click on, let me just go back into this here. So I'll open that up in a new tab because I need to identify more information here. I'll just get rid of that for now. This is really weird. It keeps on running the checks here, but I'll just go back into agents and we'll click on this one here. By the way, I actually just want to see whether that we still have anyone logged in. Let me just confirm something here because I couldn't have wished for a better demo of this here. So Ubuntu server, if I open up the Lish console and I say who, yeah, this is still not displaying anything else. So netstat antp, yeah, so it looks like that comes from, okay, so we have the Wazuh agent, that's fine. On port 22, there's that IP, and yeah, okay, so if I say who now, that is very, very interesting. Okay, if we take a look at the earlier results, we could see that we had another SSH session, or that was the attack, I'm guessing, but there was an established session here. That was unknown. Very interesting. That was coming from the same IP address. Huh. Oh, that actually looks, the foreign address is right over here, right? So that's the foreign, that's the local address. This is the foreign address, right? So this one here and this one here are anomalies. Either way, we can see that that's very interesting. Password, let's try and log in, and let's see if that's actually logged, because the who command should display that. Huh, that's not letting me log in. I'm just going to say root. Okay, yeah, so that worked out fine. So I'll say who again. And yeah, so you can see the other session. But if they did log in successfully, I should have seen that, because if there was a successful authentication attempt, we would have been able to see it from Wazuh again anyway. So yeah, I clicked on my agent here. So we're going to security events. It should tell me whether there was a successful authentication attempt. So authentication success, that looks about right here. So let's look at this one here. This was the earlier one where the login root. Yeah, that's with PAM. That makes sense. Yeah. And we have another one here. Does it also display the actual IP? So the agent IP, the manager name. If I click on this here. Okay, yeah, so that looks good. Either way, in order for us to block these types of attacks, what I was looking for, if I go back into the Linux agent here and I click on security events, and we click on this right over here, what we're looking for is the rule ID, right? So the rule ID is 5710. Okay, so we know that now. So we want to set the rule ID to 5710, and we can then set the location to local. Location, where do we want to do that? The agent that reported that event, I think that's what we need to specify. So the agent name is localhost. I'm not sure if that'll work, because the last time I did this, I know you could specify the IP address here. Let's actually see if this works. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and I'm then going to restart the manager here, and we can get rid of that window there. And let's see if this actually works. So yeah, I'll give that a couple of seconds to restart the manager. All right, so I've restarted the manager, and if we click on this here now, you can see that, yeah, in terms of the Mitre card that's being displayed, the top tactics look like credential access. We also have a few Privesc ones. That's very interesting. Let's click on that tactic here. So the technique here, so that's a PAM session. Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. Privilege escalation, defense evasion. What did we do there? Is this the same thing? Yeah, that's still PAM. Using the PAM module for authentication, OSS. Okay, yeah, so that looks fine now. Persistence, did we do anything? Yeah, that's still the actual authentication there, right? So if we go into security events, let's wait on this to load up. We can see it's still under attack. I want to see if the rule that we've set up is actually active. So that's for the brute force attack. We can see that this is still being performed, and the user is Jacob or whatever that name is. So let's actually see whether this is working, right? So the only way to test it is to sort of, I'm just going to, if I say who here one more time, I just want to make sure I close up the Lish session, and let me just exit, and I can try and ping that target. So instead of saying SSH, we can ping it, and let's see, because I'm running this from another network or from another external IP. Okay, so I also want to see if that is actually noted. Okay, so let's try and say SSH. Actually, I want to try and log in with another user to simulate a brute force attack, which I can do with Hydra, but I'm not going to do that now. So test, hit an incorrect password, hit an incorrect password there again. Huh. Okay, let's see. It should actually tell me that authentication failed. If it hangs like this, then it means there's something going on, or that actually did work. So let me just terminate that again. Yep, looks like it works. Looks like that defense rule or that reactive rule works. Okay, so fantastic. So that's active response. So that's how to respond to an attack. Let me just refresh this here. Boy, we still have a lot to talk about, but it's good that we actually went, out of our way to see how to do that. So let's see. Let's see. How many authentication failures have there been? Attempt to log in as a non-existent user. Was that us? No, that's Oracle. No, that is done. Interesting. Let's see. We should have our attempt here. Our attempt being logged here. There we are. So that's test. I think the attack should cool down now. So the only way we'll know that is let's see whether they're... Because I know their IP addresses are changing, but based on what we specified, that should actually work. Yeah, so that looks like it's stuck at 209. Was this still the Oracle user? The only way we'll know whether this has worked is, if we just go ahead and continue with what I wanted to cover. Right, okay, so let's click back on our agent here. And we had talked about, the actual security events. But yeah, let's move on to integrity monitoring, which I was actually covering. And then... So yeah, there's nothing yet. Under events, if we modified or created a new user, can I actually log in again? Yeah, that's blocked. The only way I'll be able to gain access now is through the leash. So let me open that up here. And okay, cool. So if I say who now, oh boy, I keep on typing that same command again and again. How can I get rid of that window here? Doesn't allow me to disable that. Interesting. So if I just hit enter, because if I hit Control L and hit enter, that doesn't do anything there. So let me just open that up again. So we'll give this a couple of seconds. So if I say who, yeah, so this is currently us. Okay, netstat ANTP. If I try and modify a file, like for example, let's see, if I try and change maybe... if I say, let's see, cat etc password. If I create another user, so I can say user add, we can say M, and I can then add a test user. So actually, let's not do that. Let's go for a very hard user. So I'll say Zeus. So user add M Zeus, and the shell is bin bash. And then we'll say user mod. We can just say password or create a password for that user. So password Zeus, and I'll just say, actually, I don't want any simple passwords. So there we go. Okay, so that should actually be logged. That actually should be logged under the, this is the configuration page. It should be logged here under integrity monitoring. So again, if we go back to our modules, there we are, and we click on system auditing there, this is going to add the following there. If we actually, let's go back a step here, because I know that what I wanted to showcase is going to be, actually that's under the actual main page here. Apologies for that. Right, so the system auditing, audit users behavior, monitoring command execution, and alerting on access to critical files. Okay, so that means that if anyone tries anything funny, then we'll be able to see that. Okay, so let's go back into our agents here, and we'll click on security events. Looks like we have a few attempts there. Okay. So I don't know whether that's still being blocked. Okay, but I think that's another IP. So it's going to reduce it, I guess. But you know, we can customize that based on our own parameters. It really doesn't matter. As I said, if we take a look at the configuration here again, and we see that active response configuration that I set up. Let's see if I can find it. No, that's all the way at the bottom. Give that a couple of seconds. There we are. So active response. So that was firewall drop. The other ones that we have here, firewall drop. Yeah, that's correct. So timeouts are allowed. So firewall drop, local host. That's the agent there, because I do know the location might be an issue. Yeah, so I think that looks fine. So again, if I know we set it to 1,000 seconds there. So if we try and log in here, it looks like, yeah, we do know that the attackers are using other IPs, which is why we're still getting other authentication attempts there. And, you know, we can also, if we click on events here, then we should be able to add the geolocation to see that change occurring. So this was, let's go into the geolocation location. I believe, was that added there? We can just add the city name there. Yeah, for the other ones, it doesn't look like we're getting that. That's very interesting. This was us, definitely. Yeah, if we click on that there, we should see that this was indeed, that's still Vios. That's very interesting. Ham. Yeah, okay, anyway, we know that we specified the options correctly, but it looks like the other alerts being generated here, because I know the SSH. Let me talk a little bit about filtering, because we can also filter this here. So rule groups, we can also add another filter if we want through the actual search functionality. Or we can just use the filtering option here. So in this case, we can look for the ID. In this case, what we're looking for specifically is the rule ID. So we can say rule.id and say is, and we specify the value as 5710 to only show those attempts. So those are the brute force attempts. So let's save there. And that should actually reflect. So it's currently loading. There we are. So it's only displaying those ones now. Very interesting. Okay, so we can refresh that. And okay, yeah, so that's going to take a couple of seconds. Is that another user? Probably another user, but I think we've slowed it down. I think we have slowed it down. Yeah, it looks like. So we go back to the dashboard. Authentication failure. Yeah, that's going down, but we want to get rid of that filter. That'll give us the accurate picture. Yeah, so I think we have been able to mitigate that attack, but just again, as I said, this was totally unscripted. This just goes to show you how you can do that yourself, how you can actively respond to a particular attack. As I said, there's multiple other options that you can use. So again, I'll just show you this one more time because I think it's very important. But if I click on management and let's go back down there, management, configuration, and we can then move along because I wanted to highlight vulnerabilities. So edit configuration, and let's take a look at that active response. Not really sure where I specified it. There we are. It should be here. There we are. Okay, so these are the active responses available. So by default, you can see that this one is global, which means that this is for whitelisting. You can also disable an account if you want. You can restart Wazuh. Firewall drop is what we used. You can also use the host deny option there, which is fairly similar. So, and you can also do this for Windows as well, if you wanted to as well. But yeah, in our case, we were able to do that. We can probably increase the timeout if we wanted to, but hey, I think we're wasting too much time on that now. So let's go back into agents, and we'll click on the Linux one here. And what I wanted to focus on was the actual vulnerabilities So if we click on localhost and we go back into integrity monitoring, I know that this shouldn't have logged anything yet, but even though we created another user, so I'll go back into modules, and that took me back into agents. So localhost, and we click on SCA. All right, so this is very important. This is the security configuration assessment, right? So as it says here, this is using the CIS benchmark for Debian Linux 10. So this document provides a descriptive or prescriptive guidance for establishing, essentially establishing compliance for this particular Linux system. So you can see the current score is 38%. So what does this mean? This is essentially the equivalent of auditing your system with Linux. So it performs an audit, right? A security audit, and it tells you that all of these checks failed, right? So it's pretty much giving you recommendations as to what you need to do to increase or improve the security of this system, or to harden it, if you will. So if we click on the second page, let's look at a few important options, because I know these are not really that important in the context of security. There we are. So ensure sudo is installed, that is passed. Ensure the sudo log file exists, that's not done. So you can start to see from this information being displayed, you can actually learn a lot about how to secure a system regardless of the operating system, as I'll show it for Windows as well. If I click on export, I do know that this usually has an error or an issue, but there we are. You can actually export it as an actual CSV sheet. And again, this will also be displayed under events, but the filter is essentially applied accordingly. So you can see these are the CIS benchmarks here. Let's go back into that agent there. And we were talking about system auditing, which is what we did, I believe. System auditing events. That's not yet given us any output, which is fine. And then we have vulnerabilities. Okay, so this is the vulnerability scan or vulnerability detection, where it essentially scans the system, on which the agent is installed, and it gives you, it sorts it based on critical severity, vulnerabilities, high severity, medium, etc. So if we click on high or critical, if you will, you can see that we have the following CVEs. So as I said, you can learn more by clicking on the events tab there. So these are the vulnerabilities here. So if we click on it, you can see that the agent IP is provided there. The data vulnerability CVE version is there. Ideally, would look for criticality. So it's a 9.8, which is pretty crazy. The attack vector is network, and then you can perform research on this, right? So an issue is discovered in klibc before 2.0.9. Additions in the malloc function may result in an integer overflow and a subsequent heap buffer overflow. Yeah, so, really, really useful information. So, we can go back into the dashboard, and again, you can then click on the inventory here to essentially display the actual vulnerabilities and or the CVEs that affect a particular package. In this case, it looks like it's mostly it's mostly BusyBox that is being affected, but yeah, that's the vulnerability page. If I click back on it, which I'll do right now, you can see that the dashboard gives you, or visually displays the data so that it makes sense, right? And you can see that you have the most common CVEs, the top affected packages by CVEs. In this case, libmount is critical here, and then we have all of the other packages there. So fairly simple to understand. Let's go back here to our dashboard. We then have Mitre, right, which is the last thing I wanted to focus on, which you should have an understanding of right now. So this is where threat intelligence comes into play, as I said. So you can see on the dashboard, it tells us that pretty much the attack that we're dealing with right now is a brute force attack. And this tells us the same thing here. You can see it's credential access, right? And in this case, it gives us the type of alerts. In this case, they are brute force attack alerts. And the same thing it does here, brute force, brute force. So we know what the issue is. And of course, you can expand the actual range here. So in my case, I'm showing the last 24 hours, and you can get the same information from the events. The only difference is here, as you'll see from the columns, is you'll actually get the Mitre the Mitre attack ID. That's the tactic ID, and then the actual name, and you get it right over here. So the rule level is 5 and rule ID is as follows. So based on the actual settings that we had set up, we would not be getting email notifications regarding this because this is fairly common. We would, however, be actually all of these would be logged because they're above 3, right? The rule level is above 3. So yeah, if you take a look at the framework here, you can search for this is really awesome. You can actually search for specific tactics and their techniques. So, we can see in our case, it looks like we have a few issues with brute force attacks, and then it gives you a description and it tells you, when the last one was. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. Yeah, so that's the Mitre attack module. As I said, there's the other options here in regards to regulatory compliance, but we're not really interested in that at that point. But this is the dashboard that you'll be provided with. So it essentially contains the Mitre module. You then have compliance. In terms of FIM, you have the recent events, and then you have the you have the last scan performed in regards to providing you with guidance for establishing a secure configuration posture there. And then of course you have the events count, the event count evolution. So this gives you a sort of like a trend as to when, and the graph is fairly easy to understand. You have the count here, and then you have the actual time at the bottom. So it tells you, when you're experiencing the highest amount of attacks. So yeah, fairly cool stuff. If you click on stats here, you can see that in this case, let's take a look at it here. Yeah, that just displays the stats for that particular agent there. So, you can pretty much tell where most of the events are coming from. So active responses log, auth.log 93. And in this case, it looks like the events pertinent to the active responses log. So it looks like it is responding correctly. So our rule or the active response configuration that we set up is working correctly. Messages sent 903. You get the idea. Okay, so yep, I think that's what I wanted to cover from that perspective. I also wanted to show you the Windows agent because I completely forgot about it as we were dealing with a brute force attack, and I know this video is way over where it's supposed to be in terms of duration, but you can see that this system is vulnerable. And if I take a look at the security events, I performed a few attacks on it. I added a new user just to show you how that looks from an internal perspective. You can see right over here, user logged on. That was me. You can actually tell that from the time. There's an error event there, win logon success. That's because I actually logged on. And then I know I created another user here. So let's just take a step back here because that was actually logged. So there we are. I created a user here, and you're pretty much getting all of these. Events, which is very, very important, right? And of course, you can click on the events page, and you can add additional fields based on what you're looking for. As I said, this makes much more sense to explore in the context of the Linux agent because it's currently under attack. So we have much more data to analyze. So if we go to security events, let's take a look at our threat surface at this point in time. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I know that's really high at this point, but it looks like they're changing their tact. So in this case, the high alerts are pertinent to, I think, the CVE. So if we patch this, then, we should be good in regards to that. So if we clear this filter here, you can see authentication failure. And what we can do is let's click on events. Let's perform a little bit of analysis here. And what I can do is we can also add a filter here to limit it by the rule ID. So I'm just going to say rule ID, and we're going to say that is 5710. Okay, and I'm just going to hit save. And ideally, I would like to know where the attacks are coming from. So as I said, that can be obtained by clicking on the available fields here. So we can add the geolocation location. Guessing that gives us, let's see, yeah, that's latitude and longitude. So I'll get rid of that there because I really don't need that here. What I want is the geolocation, city, or the country. Yeah, that will be very useful in our case. So let's add that there. Yeah, yeah, that's definitely where you'd expect it to come from. So, you have Russia, etc. By the way, this was me. I know that this was me here because that's Kenya, unless we have an attacker from Kenya. Yeah, that's test. So, yeah, I think the attacks have actually slowed down because apart from those ones there, we had a couple of other ones, but it looks like they're switching IPs, which is why we're still getting brute force attacks. The only good thing in our case is the fact that they are being blocked. And what we can do is I can actually show you how to also view the response alerts or events, if you will. As I said, if you get rid of the filters and you click on the events, you can actually see the active response rules here, or events, if you will. So you can actually see the host blocked this particular IP address or this particular attempt. So we do know that it works. With that being said, we've covered quite a lot, and this exercise has been very fruitful because I didn't expect an SSH attack at this point. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. I'm just going to switch over back into the slides. So if you have any questions or recommendations, or if you had any issues with this video, you can take a look at the slides provided to you, or you can reach out to me and the Hackersploit community on our Discord server. The link to that is in the description section. If you want to register for part 2 of this series, you can also access that by clicking the link in the description, and you can access part 2 for free. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at how to perform intrusion detection with Suricata. So I'll be seeing you in the next video.